Greetings, I'm John Moulder, a jazz musician and an educator who also has spent over 25 years in pastoral ministry and has been devoted a lot in my life to unpacking the riches of Scripture for congregations through preaching. A couple of years ago, I was asked by the Collegeville Institute in Minnesota to come and to give workshops to clergy who were interested in the interface between spirituality and the arts, and were also developing their own creative pursuits as well as pastoring in parishes. These workshops on spirituality and the arts planted the seeds for a project that I'm doing now with the Louisville Institute, where I've been exploring the ways in which jazz music can inform and be a resource for homiletic preparation and practice. Now, I've been impressed with how much dedicated work and preparation is needed to preach, as well as to play as an improvising musician. Homiletics in its own way is an art form, and much attention in preaching has been devoted to theological background, to exegesis, and undoubtedly this is important. And yet much less attention has been focused upon the arts and the way that, for instance, jazz music can inform and be a resource for preaching. I've been interested in exploring the ways in which a pastor could revitalize their homiletic preparation and execution by engaging in the process that jazz musicians engage in. So the question I really wish to explore more fully is, how can the creative process of improvisational jazz be adopted by preachers and then applied to the art and craft of homiletic preparation and execution? Can jazz improvisational approaches and ways of evaluating them, such as the strength of ideas, the coherence of ideas, pacing, the balance of intellect and emotion, the balance of tradition and innovation, can these various considerations serve to enhance the pastor's preparation and execution of sermons? When I was just starting to think through the project, it was Richard Pitt from Vanderbilt who was working with us at the Louisville Institute, and he was very encouraging about my idea, and he remarked, "Oh, I see what you're getting at. You're trying to draw what I experienced as a youth in the African American Baptist traditions, where there was much improvisation, into the mainline traditions of prepared and more scripted preaching." He goes, "I think you're really onto something." And I hope I am. I think improvisation is one vehicle and one part of our toolkit that we can employ for effective and meaningful preaching. One of the things that Richard said was that when he was a kid in those churches, that it almost felt like the Spirit was alive, animating the preacher in the moment, that something was emerging and was erupting in the moment, and that was a very exciting aspect of how he experienced the preacher in those times. Improvisation can facilitate moments of feeling like you are in the moment and something is emerging and erupting in the moment. Creation is taking place right then, right there. George Gershwin once said, "Life's a lot like jazz. It's best when you improvise." Now, there are many positive outcomes from cultivating your skills as an improviser, such as finding your own voice, being more in touch with your congregation and how you are interacting with them. However, I should disclose that this doesn't mean that every preacher should always improvise. I'm not necessarily advocating that. I've experienced some excellent, prepared, and scripted homilies that are rich and meaningful, that are profound. And yet one of the things to watch for, if your homily is scripted and prepared in that fashion, is that sometimes it can block the emotional content that you wish to convey. One of the things you might find is that in improvising, it can help you to become more independent from the text that you've created, more unfettered by it. Now, having said that, the most seasoned homilists will tell you that sometimes there's a very specific way that they wish to express an idea, or a very precise manner in which they wish to articulate their insight. Like C.S. Lewis once said, words cut to the heart of reality. And so in preaching something in a particular way, powerfully assists in cutting to the essence of what you wish to communicate, then definitely commit that to memory, or perhaps write it in text form so that you can refer to it, because you want to say it exactly in that manner. Now, this is analogous, see, to what we in music call composition. It's something that's pre-written and codified in more permanent form. Now, what I will discuss a little bit later is that in various forms of jazz music, there's a balance between composition and improvisation, and different balances between them depending on what the genre of jazz we're speaking of. So that same difference or balance in composition and improvisation can be incorporated into a homily. You can have a lot of composition with a little improvisation, or perhaps something that is primarily improvised. Now, so let's get started. This video is intended to introduce you into some principles and practices of the improvising musician and how they might apply to the art form of homiletic preparation. So I'd like to look at 5 principles or ways of thinking about music that jazz musicians bring, and then 5 practices that you might be able to adopt in your own homiletic preparation and execution. Perhaps it's useful to think of it this way, that preachers need a toolkit, and improvisation is merely one tool that you have to employ. So when we're looking at improvisation, I think where we'll start, as I say, is with these 5 principles and practices, but then I'm going to apply it to your preparation or execution of a homily with children. I think for 2 reasons. One is that children greatly benefit from speakers when they improvise. They feel more connected, I believe, when they do, but also that you might feel less anxiety or pressure when you're starting to improvise as a speaker, as a preacher, when you work with children. So let's begin with 5 ideas to reflect upon before diving into the practice of improvisation. So the first one is for us to consider, what is improvisation? And before discussing that, I'd like to dispel what I believe are some myths about improvisers. Many people believe that high-level jazz improvisation is just about winging it, making it up. Now, in one way that's true. You are spontaneously creating in the moment. And if I were to define improvisation, I would say it is spontaneous composition in real time. But in no way are seasoned jazz improvisers just winging it. Many years of practice and discipline are required so that you can download your ideas in the present moment in an artful, coherent, compelling manner. And so the same goes for when you're improvising as a speaker. So really, to the contrary, to spontaneously be able to go where music is taking you, I mean, for the musician involves years of training with chords and scales and arpeggios and aesthetic considerations and preparation, working and reworking your craft. So similarly, in homiletics, to download your message in the moment, see benefits from much practice. And this is not to scare you at all, but maybe so that you understand that you probably improvise more than you think in your life already. So I'd encourage you to think of the ways that you improvise in telling a story, in recounting an incident, in being with your family or friends and relating your ideas. This is something that we will return to later. But the first misconception is that jazz is just winging it. In reality, jazz is a high art form where it's spontaneous composition in real time. So improvisation demands a kind of musical mindfulness where you're aware of what you wish to express, aware of the musicians around you, and in a similar way, improvisation in homiletics, you're aware of your message, but you're also aware of people, their reactions, and especially if it's a dialogical homily, you'll be tuned in to their content as well. So the number 3 thing that I think would be something that jazz musicians think about or experience regularly is that jazz is inherently dialogical. So there's a back and forth movement, and some of the most riveting performances in jazz involve a group where it's as if you're eavesdropping on a deep conversation. The call and response of African music influenced the development of jazz. And even if you're only speaking, if you're the only one speaking as a homilist, you can create a space that is dialogical by pausing and letting people come to their own reflections, or even asking a question that solicits or elicits from them a kind of response internally. So it could be with a story you've told, an idea you've raised, but pregnant pauses and questions can be ways that you facilitate a dialogical back and forth between you and your congregation. So the 4th idea that jazz musicians oftentimes think about is about finding your own voice as an artist. In this, they might consider there's a balance between tradition and innovation in one's artistic endeavors. And so, as with other art forms, the jazz musician inherits a musical tradition, a language that they're indebted to. But through much time and effort in expressing their musical ideas, they'll gradually come to find what is their own voice through it all, their unique and characteristic way of expressing themselves in the moment musically. And so similarly, improvising one's own message can help a homilist come to a deeper realization of their own unique perspective, their own distinctive worldview, as it were. And so number 5, an idea that jazz musicians think about is the balance between composition and improvisation in various styles of jazz music. You really realize when you look through jazz history that there's entirely different balances between those two things in various forms of music. From the big band era, which had a lot of pre-written composition and arrangements, and yet some improvisation, to the bebop era, which followed it, where composition and arrangement really was almost an afterthought in some ways, and where there was 90% or more of improvisation, where it was highly improvised music, to after it, post to hard bop, where they tried to reclaim more, incorporating more composition into their music. So this is just to say to you that your own homiletic preparation can have a very different balance between those two, and depending on the situation. If you're working with children, maybe you have a high degree of improvisation in your homily. But if you're working with, in a very specific situation where you want things to be very specifically articulated, you might resort more to prepared and scripted preaching with a smaller element of improvisation. So the 5 ideas I'd ask you to consider that could inform and perhaps be plant seeds of different thoughts for you in your own preparation are what jazz is, that it's not winging it, that number 2, it's spontaneous composition in real time, that number 3, remember it's inherently dialogical, and number 4, improvisation involves finding one's own voice and expressing it. And number 5, that it has this balance, that there is this balance that jazz musicians see between composition and improvisation. One of my friends named Steve Yastro, who I've known since high school, the two of us were great friends and played guitar in the hallways of the high school we attended, and he recently has been doing some very interesting work in applying principles of improvisation to sales and marketing. You might be interested in consulting his book, which has a fun title. It's called Ditch the Pitch, The Art of The Art of Improvised Persuasion. And one of the key principles that Steve talks about is input before output. And actually, it's not only a principle, it's practice. So to consider input before output, whether you're in a sales transaction, in a jazz ensemble, or for our purposes, giving a homily, it's important first to listen, to be alert, to be mindful, and to notice more, as he says. As a homilist, this helps you pick up on the mood of the congregation and establishes almost a feedback loop where you can access what is registering, what's creating interest in your congregation, and what isn't. Second practice is practice improvising your message. And you can practice during the week in many ways. By consulting any willing listener. It could be family members, it could be friends, it could be on a phone conversation with colleagues where you're trying to figure out how you'd like to express your homiletic ideas. You can do it with parishioners in a more informal way. Or you can improvise your message in private. So practice different ways of expressing the same idea and have fun with it. Have fun playing with words. And this becomes very useful, as I said, with children, since you need to be mindful of language and concepts that they can understand, and of course ones that will not register for them. So the second practice is in improvising your message in a number of different ways throughout the week. Number 3 is jazz is all about rhythm and groove. And so prosody is the study of rhythm, intonation, stress, related attributes in speech or in poetry. Now, it is the pattern of stress or intonation in a language that is what prosody refers to. William Borden from the University of Chicago, referring in a more psychotherapeutic context, described prosody as the music within your words that confer meaning. So in other words, improvising your message by varying the words you use to express your ideas is only one way of improvising a homily. You can also take a scripted text and by changing one's prosody, transform the homily. An excellent example of this, look at Reverend Michael Curry. Do you remember from the royal wedding with Prince Harry and the now Duchess Meghan Markle? Notice he had an iPad in front of him, but he rarely referred to it. And who wouldn't have that in front of them with an event of this magnitude, with not only thousands of people probably there, but millions of people watching? But notice how infrequently he looks at it. He's very conversant with his topic, but most importantly, he's so animated with the spirit which he wishes to deliver that makes the concepts come alive, makes the ideas have a heart. So notice something about Michael Curry and his homily. When he's preaching, it sounds like his ideas are dawning on him in the present moment, and that the Spirit is alive with him as he improvises his message. It's not just that it was a treatise on love, which would be perhaps interesting to some and maybe not to others, but through his passion, his sincerity, his deep genuineness, it was as if all that shined through his personhood in what he was saying. So not only is he now speaking about love, but he's connecting each listener to their most profound and intimate experiences of love. Now that's powerful in my mind. Prosody, the music of one's words, played a powerful role, I believe, in that homily. He's not just speaking about the Spirit of love, he's speaking from the Spirit of love. And so the Spirit of love, it's as if it's animating his speech and the music in his words. So being too scripted, I think, can keep emotional content under wraps in a way. And that he didn't do. His emotions were right there with people. Being conversant with the ideas of your homily will help you then with allowing an improvisation with the prosody of your words. Now, perhaps you've noticed other great speakers like Martin Luther King or Barack Obama who breathe life into a prepared script, improvising not just the words that they're speaking, but in the manner in which it's delivered. And that's the key thing, I think, for us here. Notice how many gifted orators, the rhythm by which one idea follows upon the other, and the pace and the intensity that builds in the process of their delivery. You know, I was fortunate to catch this show on, I think it's the FX channel, from, it was a show I think called Pose, where a dance teacher brought an aspiring dancer to the side after rehearsal, and she says to him, "You weren't you weren't rehearsing today." She said, "No, you were dancing. Rehearsal's getting ready for life. Dancing is living it." For an artist, she said, greatness happens when you can take something organized and make it feel as if it were improvised. You've been doing that. And she said, that's something that I can't teach. Now, I might differ from the fact that I think that improvisation, you can help a person to claim that for themselves, to get into an improvisational framework. And I do that with workshops with people on homiletics, and certainly do it with my students in improvisation. But the point I wish to make is that in a homily, improvisation might occur through word choice, or it might occur through the music in your words, the prosody. Prosody is a powerful dimension of the spoken word, and it benefits from your being immersed in the flow of things, attuned to your own emotions. And this, I think, will help to bring life and your own sincerity and your own personhood into the homily that you're preaching. And so number 4, a fourth practice that you can adopt, that jazz musicians utilize, is something that my friend Steve Yastro calls turning every presentation into a conversation. So the fourth practice is turn every presentation into a conversation. And I think he mentioned this because, as I said before, jazz is inherently dialogical. And so when he talks about this idea, I think one of the important things to think about is when you're in a homily, as I mentioned before, a lot of times it seems unidirectional, right? I am speaking to you. And yet I can make pauses in my conversation that let you register material, maybe come up with your own thoughts and ideas, maybe come up with your own questions, particularly if I ask a question, but perhaps even if I don't. So in the process, turning a presentation into a conversation engages the congregation. One of the things Steve said, I'll repeat it to you when we were talking, he said, well, what will help communicate more? You provide all the answers or just all the input, or you live the questions with them? See, rather than giving the answers, there's a way of improvising where it's almost like you're co-creating the meaning together. So you're giving your input, it's not like you aren't, but at the same time, you're allowing the space, the opportunity for the congregation, for them to generate their own insights, perhaps the way that the Spirit is working in and through you and in through the scriptures that they've just heard. So the fifth practice that you can adopt, that jazz musicians are quite accustomed to, is practice improvising within form and structure. So oftentimes there's a structure in jazz. This could be like chord changes that are moving along to a song, or perhaps sections of songs that musicians improvise within. Now, I used to offer workshops on children's liturgies and homilies for children with a colleague of mine, Robert Piercy. And Bob was fond of quoting Doogie Howser. Do you ever remember him? He was the child prodigy doctor in the series where he was, I think, a teenager and a medical doctor. And at the end of every episode, he would ask 3 questions. What happened? What does it mean to me? And how will it change my life? Now, these 3 questions captivated Bob, and he used them quite frequently for unpacking liturgies with children after they had experienced it, thinking about what happened, what does it mean to me, how will it change my life? But he also used it in preparation for homilies. So those same 3 questions are something that you can invite, for instance, if you're working with children, invite them to ponder. So what happened in the gospel passage? What does it mean to you? How might it change, or how will it change your life? So unpacking that, and anyone who's worked with children will understand this, that could go anywhere. And so you're on to improvise with them in terms of, wow, how you integrate that back in with the message, draw them in if they go afield. It can actually be a lot of fun once you get used to it. But then you can also speak from those and improvise from those 3 questions. What happened in the scripture, and what does it mean to you? And how does it change your life? Those are 3, in a way of structuring the form of the homily, but where you can improvise within those 3 questions. So, for example, the gospel story might involve Jesus forgiving a sinner. You can share well, first of all, you can ask the children, what happened? What does that mean to them? Now, this can be very different depending, did they grow up in a family where there was a lot of forgiveness, or maybe not, or where they've witnessed it a lot in various interactions, or maybe not. Then how will it change your life? Does it make you a more forgiving person? Does it call you to try to forgive in instances where you might be tempted to retaliate? So exploring the children's reactions to those 3 questions allows you to improvise and weave them together and integrate it with your own. Opening yourself to their reactions makes the experience much more dialogical, which is what we talked about as the essence of jazz, more improvisational, turns a presentation into a conversation, and it's a way whereby you can improvise within a structure to those 3 questions. Keep in mind as you're doing this that you might want to start slow and see how it goes for you initially. You might start in situations like if you're in a congregation that has daily liturgies, you can do it there. It's a smaller group of people. Or to do it with children in another setting other than a liturgy. Can get you started in the process of how you might go about it in an actual worship setting. Keep in mind, this might not be for everyone. And if you're a person that does well with more scripted approaches, and if you don't feel the aptitude for improvising, then you needn't proceed further. But begin to notice how much you improvise in daily life. I think, for example, I have a clergy friend who at times he speaks beautifully from a much more prepared, scripted manner. But when you're talking with him off the cuff about the various ideas that are germinating within him, it's like he's riffing on the ideas at times and is very engaging in a different way than he is when he's more connected with a formalized script. So I just ask that you consider that for your own self and notice those times when you are less scripted, when you're improvising the way you're telling something, and where it builds momentum. has a lot of coherence and meaning, because in those times, you are likely improvising your message. So pay attention to those times, and it might open up doors for you to improvise and consider improvising in this way through your sermons and preaching, not only to children's, but it can also have great applications for preaching with adults. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy working on this. If you have questions, know that you can consult me about this topic. Be glad to talk with you. In the meantime, happy improvising.